Welcome to the Historical Society of Long Beach's Public Oral History with the Honorable Evan Anderson Braude and City Prosecutor Doug Haubert. So this evening is part of a tradition that started in 2009 when we did the Mayor's Oral History series and we interviewed all the living mayors of Long Beach. Following that, we started interviewing barrier breakers. And tonight we have the honor of celebrating Evan a little bit. We haven't honored someone or interviewed someone who's been so close to the Historical Society for so long. He's served on the board for a very long time. So it's fun to get to celebrate Evan. Somehow 25 years ago, I convinced him to champion the Historical Society along with the other nonprofits he was involved in, like Bethzetic Legal Services. And ever since, he has been a great supporter. I'm grateful for your support to the HSLB, and I'm grateful to your support of me. The Historical Society has a museum and an archive in Bixby Knolls, and we have archival materials that researchers use all the time to do research. One of the things that your support helps us do is to process collections like Evan's. So we have 25 boxes from Evan that we'll be processing. I know that he has decades of event photos in his phone and his computer, and we also need to get those because he really has an important historical record of Long Beach events. So thank you for agreeing to do this today. I'd also like to thank Doug Haubert, our city prosecutor, for taking on this tough job of interviewing or prosecuting Evan. That's Doug's joke. Doug has a list of his own accomplishments, of course. For 26 years, he's had experience as a civil and criminal prosecutor. He is recognized as a leader in court diversion programs, providing nonviolent first-time offenders with work readiness programs. I want to make a few little housekeeping announcements. Please silence your cell phones because we are recording and we want to be able to hear what Evan has to say. If you need the restroom, it's back by the elevators that you came up on. And around 7 o'clock, we will have a 15-minute intermission, and we'll come back for a little more interview and a few questions from all of you. So without more announcements, Doug, will you get the interview started, please?
It would be my pleasure. Hopefully you can hear me. Not yet. Is this on? We didn't test these. There we go. Now I know it's working. All right. Well, welcome, everyone. And the cameras don't show this, but this is a packed house here at the law firm of Keesal, Young, and Logan. So what a wonderful opportunity to get to know someone that I think many of us consider a good friend. But when I first started talking to Evan about this event, I learned a lot about his background, his career, both in politics and as an attorney, and I think we're all going to learn a lot today. He's had an exciting career, and we're going to jump right into it. I do want to note how interesting it is that we get to turn the table on a lawyer. He's used to asking the questions, but today he's going to be deposed. And under oath and under film, you're going to be answering questions that we want to know about you, okay? Those are the ground rules. You ready?
Maybe.
Well, I want to start with your upbringing because I think you have one of the most interesting childhoods because you were involved in politics from a very early age. In fact, you say that you have two fathers that raised you, one of which was very prominent in politics. So why don't we just start there? How did you, at an early age, get so involved in politics?
Both my parents, my biological father and mother, were both involved in Democratic Party politics, both local and statewide. My father, I don't remember this, but I was told by him on more than one occasion that he often took me around when we would go door to door handing out literature for people that we were supporting for office. So I did that when I would think as early as 4 years old.
Wow.
And I got, and I think that just, I would go to a number of events with them. In fact, one of the things I disliked and probably somehow made me who I am in a sense about my feelings about smoking, we would go to these Democratic parties, meetings, and I would generally go outside because the room was filled with smoke.
Literally the smoke-filled room.
Yes.
Okay, of politics.
And I would get sick from being in there. And so later on when I was on the council, I was sponsored the strongest anti-smoking legislation we had in the city.
Well, by the way, we started with your father's, but your mother was a political dynamo in her own right.
She was. She was very involved in a lot of campaigns, but she also was secretary of the state party, the Democratic State Party. For those of you who are Republicans, that's okay. She worked closely with Republicans too. But the reality was that she was very involved. In fact, she was, I think, secretary at the same time that when Glenn, who became her husband after my parents separated, he was the chairman of the Democratic Party. So we go back, back then. Back in those days when they used to have their state party conventions, they didn't have them always in the big city, in like Los Angeles or San Francisco they would have them in Modesto. They would have them in Bakersfield because that's where people had to drive. They didn't fly to places. They didn't, they ended up going. So we used to take these long drives. To me, it was long because I was small at the time. Anyway, I guess it was built into me to be involved in that way, and so I was. When I was growing up, and after my parents split, I was 8 years old. My mother remarried at 10 to Glenn Anderson, and she told me, she said, one of the things he's going to be doing is he's going to be running for lieutenant governor, and then maybe he'll be governor, and maybe he'll be president. Like I knew, at 10 years old.
Did you know what lieutenant governor was when you were 10?
No.
No.
I think she explained it to somewhat. I remember though that I was, as a child, you understand that you don't like the fact that your parents are split. And the first time I saw Glenn after I found out he was going to be my stepfather, I was introduced to him and I kicked him hard in the shins. I was an impetuous, whatever. Anyway, the fact is that he made it very good. He was a stepfather, but he was very good how he treated me and treated his own kids. I became part of the family entirely, and so that was a good thing. My parents actually wanted us. We lived in separate places, and we would get together for each of our birthdays. It so happens our birthdays were exactly 2 months apart. There was 3 kids, 2 adults, and then there was the holidays. And so it turns out we were every time. So we would get there. My parents formed a corporation just so that we could participate, and to get us to go to these meetings, even as we got older, they made sure we got a fee for showing up at the meeting. I know it sounds funny, but the reality is that when everybody's doing all kinds of other things, we're going to school, we're going away, we managed to find a way to get together, and it held us all together.
So around 10 years old, your mother, who's very involved in politics, marries Glenn Anderson, who became lieutenant governor. Yeah. And you told me a story once about how a number of political leaders were getting together in Yosemite, and you did not know how to swim. And at some point, you found yourself in the river. Can you tell us about that story?
Okay, so I think within 6 months after he got elected as lieutenant governor, Governor Brown, Pat Brown was the governor at the time, got elected at the same time, and a couple of the other senior people in the administration all went to Wawona Springs and to the Wawona Hotel. And so that was my first time in Yosemite. And I remember I was asked to go down where the governor was. The governor was down near the springs. It was like a little, not a river, but I guess it was a small river, a tributary. And I was kind of scared about getting in the water there because it was sort of rapid at that moment. And the governor came up to me and said, "Come on with me. I'll show you how to swim in this."
So Pat Brown took you swimming.
Yeah. And there was like a big rock, and we went on one side, got into the pool, and came around. And I loved it so much, I kept doing it. Anyway, the funny thing is that, later on in life, and we can talk about that, every time I would see the governor, when he was no longer governor, long after that, he was an attorney, with a firm in town here, although he was in their LA office, was Ball Hunt, Brown, and Barowitz. And probably well known, it was a well-known law firm at the time. Not as well known as Keesal, Young, and Logan, though. Anyway, the point is that I would go up to the LA office every once in a while when I was housed here at this office, and he would always say to me, "Do you remember the time I taught you how to swim in the water?" I mean, this is like 40 years later, and he always seemed to remember that aspect of it.
And Alan Cranston, I think, was at
was a
Yosemite
controller.
on that trip as well.
State controller, yes.
He was state controller back then. Okay. All right.
And before he was U.S. Senator, right.
So you showed me a picture earlier today from a newspaper clipping when you were 13. So this is 1960, and you won a prize or multiple prizes for a calf that you helped raise during a summer experience. Can we talk about that and what your parents were doing while you were at the ranch camp?
So my parents decided that this city slicker here had to learn what it meant to be living on a farm, or at least what the other half lived, or whatever. And so they asked me if I wanted to go for the summer on a dairy farm, and it was a dairy farm that they picked out. He was lieutenant governor, and he'd asked, I think, the state secretary of agriculture or something, who would be a good place to go, and they picked a farm that was a Guernsey farm. Guernsey cows are a little richer in milk than the Holsteins, and they are a smaller breed. They're not as large as some of the Holsteins. And this particular farm actually loved to go during the summer to all the fairs. So I'd see all these other things that would go on. And, but my parents decided I should go up and see them they should see me, actually, because they were worried about whether I would be acceptable to the farm people and the Orrs. Anyway, so they sent me up before that summer in '60, in April, during the Easter vacation time. And so I spent about 4 or 5 days up there. And while I was there, I saw a calf born. And it was amazing, it's 13 years old, just turned 13, and to see, a live birth like that was, something. And I actually helped a little bit. They asked me to hold something and whatever. It was out in the field. Anyway, that calf, by the time the summer rolled around, was old enough, still a young calf, but old enough to be shown. And so they asked me to take care of it, and they trained me how to work with the calf and so on and so forth. And in Sonoma County Fair, I ended up winning the first and third places, whatever, and whatever. and I, got involved. Well, the funny thing is, yes, that was nice. My parents came up one day. I showed you the picture of it, and there I am with the calf, and they're
And your medals.
And my medals. Anyway, what they didn't see was the fact that they still had to go back to the farm every night and every morning to milk the cows. So I got to stay at the fair overnight. What was my duty? Cleaning
The stalls?
the stalls, where where
That's good preparation for politics, by the way.
Yes, there was a lot of bull.
So this is July of 1960. What else was happening in Los Angeles in July of 1960 while you were at the county fair?
Well,
what
there was a
happening?
convention, a Democratic convention in Los Angeles.
The presidential
A president,
nominating
yes,
convention.
presidential nominating convention, and Glenn and my mother were there, and I was at this
Hmm.
farm, and the night they were going to be, Glenn was going to be nominating somebody or being seconding to a nomination. He seconded the nomination for Adlai Stevenson, and which later when I got a little bit older, we actually had a chance to meet and spend time with him in New York when he was the ambassador to the United Nations. But that's another story. But the fact is that I watched it, and they were there
So you were watching the convention on TV.
on a little teeny black and white TV that the farm had. They had that must have been from the late 40s, early 50s, I think.
So your dad seconded the nomination for Adlai Stevenson,
But-
he didn't win, did he?
Nope, Mr. Kennedy did.
Some guy named Kennedy won.
Some guy named Kennedy. Yeah.
So you have a lot of these stories. You basically grew up with political figures.
I met a lot of presidents over the years. I met Kennedy briefly at some point when he was in town. But the person I remember meeting the most, or twice at least, was he was first vice president. Was Johnson. Johnson. He opened up the L.A. Airport, the new one. Well, what we call the newest lady one, and that was my first time meeting him. And then he flew, when he was still vice president, he actually came to my parents' house for dinner in Sacramento, and flew in a helicopter that landed on the street, right near the house. And they had to close off the streets, for him coming. And then the last time I met him was when he was in San Francisco. Right? He was president already. And on the dais was Governor Brown and his wife and my parents. And I had worked at a Jewish camp up in Saratoga that summer. And I had come over. We had a break for a long weekend. And so I'd come over to San Francisco with a good friend of mine who lives now in New York. But my mother called and said, "Do you want to come to the dinner at the Hilton Hotel?" And I said, "Sure, I'd love to come." Well, there were demonstrations in the streets, as you know why, the Vietnam War and stuff like that, and the police were on horseback. And I borrowed a jacket from my friend, and we went over there and walked right in. I mean, there was a police officer at the front door, at a side door, but he said, I told him I was the son of who I was, and they said, "Come on in." And so we went up there, and my mother had us sitting in a table right in front of the dais with the president and all the others. And P.L. Salinger was there because he was running for Senate at the time. He lost. Anyway, the fact is that my mother said, "Do you want to come up and meet the president?" And I said, "Sure." She said, "But absolutely do not ask him for an autograph." Oh, no, I wouldn't do that. Well, how could I not? So I ended up taking the program that had his picture on it and whatever, and I put it under my jacket. And I walked, when she called me up, she said, "I'll call you up." And my friend Billy said, "Can I come up too?" She said, "No, just Evan." So I went up there, and he was talking with the governor at the time, and he turned around, and Glenn said, "I'd like to introduce you to my son," whatever. And so shook hands, and I have no idea what we talked about. I think he asked me something about, did I go to school or where I was going to school in college. I was starting college that year. And and I said, whatever I said, and then I said, "Would you mind signing this?" And as he was doing it, he said, "Oh, no problem." And I looked down, and my mother was like, she was
Do you still have that signature?
Oh, I do.
Oh, very cool.
I have
Very
that.
good.
And, no, I have quite a few over the years.
So we're going to get to your legal career and your political career. But while we're still talking about the formative years, you had a nickname, and I don't know how prevalent this nickname was, but how did you come to be called Happy? The nickname Happy. How did that stick to you?
Well, the nickname actually came from my parents. When I was around 2 weeks old, maybe a little less, it was within the first 2 weeks. And I appeared to them to be giggling and laughing and carrying on. It was a lot of gas is probably what it was. But the reality is
It's a better name than Gassy.
Yeah. And they simultaneously, I was in the crib looking down at me, and they said, "Oh, he's so happy." And so they nicknamed me Happy. And unfortunately, I don't know, unfortunately, but it stuck with me. And in fact, it wasn't until I think I was in the 9th grade or 10th grade when a teacher said, "I am not calling you Happy no matter what. I will call you Evan or I'll call you Mr. Braude, but I'm not calling you Happy." And I said, "Okay." But he was one of the few teachers that actually, wouldn't do that.
Now, you mentioned going to Jewish camp as a youth. You wanted to be a rabbi, and there was a family history there as well. When did you decide you wanted to, and how long did that stay with you?
Well, my grandfather and my great-grandfather on both sides of my father's family had been Orthodox rabbis, and my father was the only son of 5 siblings, and he chose not to be. And I was still very involved in my synagogue. I was president of the youth group. I worked at camp. I went to camp, Jewish camp, away camp. I did all these things, and I was very involved. I remember at 17, I went to a national conference, and I got very excited about meeting the people I did and hearing what they had to say. And I think my Jewish roots came out. I thought about, and I went to the Hebrew Union College for a teaching credential, and which I did. I ended up getting. At the same time I graduated at UCLA, I got that at the same time at the Hebrew Union College. But I was thinking of going on to possibly rabbinical school, maybe after. I didn't know what I was going to be doing for sure. And my mother said, "Oh, you should come with me to visit. We'll go visit our friends, Paul Ziffrin." Now, if you don't know who Paul Ziffrin is, you may remember, if some of you might remember, it was Ziffrin was a law firm, and they were up in West LA. They also were the premier law firm for like major people, the head of General Motors and other things like that. They did a lot of their tax work, et cetera. But Paul Ziffrin was also known because of the 1984 Olympics. He was the chair of the Olympic Organizing Committee. And he wasn't Uberoff. He hired Uberoff, in a sense. They did that. Anyway, they lived in the Malibu colony, and my mother was very close with them through politics. He had been the chair. He'd been the Democratic National Committeeman from California. And as it turns out, he ended up. My mother said, "Oh, let's go visit Paul and Mickey." And I said, "Oh, sure, I loved going up there." So we went in up there that day. And she had another idea in mind. And we got to talking, and we walk in, and she said, "I'm going to go talk to Mickey. You go talk to Paul. He's in his study." So I went to go talk to him, and he's asking me how I'm like college and what am I planning on doing afterwards. And I told him I was thinking of becoming a rabbi. He said, "You know what? I was going to do that too. But I ended up becoming an attorney instead first because I thought then I can do that later."
The seed was planted. Okay.
Anyway, my mother talked to him and said, "Make sure he doesn't go to rabbinical school." Anyway.
Once you saw where he lived in the Malibu colony, you said, "I think I might want to be a lawyer." Was that it?
No, he said, there were a lot of other things, but that was sort of the thing that stopped it. But it always was something in the back of my mind. And the funny thing is, since I had been at HUC, Dean Gottschalk, who became the president of the Hebrew Union College, would see me later on, even when I went to Washington, D.C., which we'll talk about later, and kept saying to me, when are you going to come back and go to school and become a rabbi? I said, probably not. I said, you need people.
There's still time, Evan.
There's still, yeah, I know. I don't think the other half of my life would be happy with that.
So you mentioned college. So you went to UCLA.
I graduated UCLA.
All right. Let's talk about that experience. And you went straight from there to law school. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. Let's talk about UCLA and thereafter.
Well, UCLA took mostly poli-sci and history and some psychology and a little drama, very drama. Anyway, when I applied to law school, I actually did not apply in Southern California. I applied to Northern California. I applied at UC Hastings.
And up to this point, you lived in Los Angeles. You still hadn't been to Long Beach yet. But
Well, no, I had lived in Los Angeles. I had lived in Sacramento, when
Sacramento,
Glenn was lieutenant governor. In fact, I worked actually in the legislature as the assistant mending clerk for the state senate. And my name still, I found my name still showing that I'm bringing bills over to the assembly side back and forth back then. And I was like 15 years old. And I remember the days when the legislature they had a deadline, at midnight, had to be finished by a certain time, but they just unplugged the clock.
Yeah.
And so,
it's not midnight.
no, it's not midnight. It's still 5 minutes to. We can still pass more legislation. And so they're not allowed to do that anymore, I think. But at the time, they did a lot of things that were, Anyway, and I worked up until, till late.
So you applied to law schools after college in Northern California.
Yeah, and I got accepted to Hastings and UC Davis. And I'd gone a couple quarters away to UC Davis, so I knew a little bit about the campus. And it was close to Sacramento. In fact, while I was there, I was a reporter for the KDVS radio station, which was on the campus. And I ended up going over to sorry, another quick story. When I was younger, and Glenn, right after he became lieutenant governor, we also went to the Rose Bowl, the Rose Parade, and then to the Rose Bowl. And at the Rose Parade, we were sitting amongst all the
VIP section, yeah.
And again, I was only 11 or 12 years old at that time, and 11, I think. And my mother said, "Why don't I introduce you to the governor and lieutenant governor?" Whatever school was playing at the Rose Bowl that day, and I honestly, right in this minute, I can't remember. I don't know if it was Michigan or Illinois or whatever. And so I was introduced, and then my mother said, "I want to also introduce you to this gentleman sitting behind you, who is the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Earl Warren." Now, considering what I became, a lawyer, and how I respected the Supreme Court at that time, and especially the Chief Justice, who had been governor of California at one time, that's before Goody Night, and then he was sitting literally right behind me, and my mother said, "Turn around and say hello to," she introduced me. And then when I turned around, in the back, at the top of the seats, were the ABC, CBS, NBC, people doing the call of the parade. I see Ronald Reagan, and I said, "Look, Mommy, there's Ronald Reagan." And I completely ignored the Chief Justice. I didn't shake his hand. I didn't care who he was. It was Ronald Reagan sitting up there in the booth talking about, obviously calling the things. And that was who I'd seen on TV. I didn't want to say hello to him. Anyway, so I don't recall.
So you pushed him out of the way to get to Ronald Reagan?
I didn't push him out. I just didn't acknowledge.
Okay.
Anyway, later on, we went to the party, and there was Ronald Reagan standing in the front door, smoking a cigarette, which people did in those days and more. Anyway, and Glenn said, "You wanted to see Ronald Reagan? Here, I'll introduce you." 'Cause at that time, he was still a Democrat. Anyway.
He was the actor.
Yeah. Anyway, so when I went to school at Davis, I went over to Ronald Reagan was governor, and I ended up getting there, and I didn't ask any questions the first time I went. The second time I went, he came out and said, he was all the troubles at Cal Berkeley, and he said, "We know who the rebel rousers are, the communists who are causing this problem," and he said, "and we're taking care of it." Well, the natural question is, who? Who are we talking about? Give me some names. And so I raised my hand, and I was the second person he called on, and I asked the question, which he completely ignored and went on to someone else. I mean, he called on me, I gave my name and who I was from, he listened to it, he listened to that, and then went on and talked to somebody else. Sitting next to me was Warren Olney from CBS News, from the radio. And he raised his hand eventually and came back to him, and he said, "Governor, I don't think you answered this gentleman's question." At which point he slammed his book closed and walked off.
Oh, wow.
Never called on me again.
Making friends. So now let's go back to law school. So you graduated from UCLA, and you ended up at Loyola.
Right.
And you graduated from Loyola Law School.
Yes.
And now we get to the part where you actually moved to Long Beach. What was your first job after law school?
Well, originally I was going to Washington, D.C. to work for the FCC. And as it turns out, because of personal things, I ended up not going and ended up needing to find a job here. And so I ended up getting a position at the naval station here. So I first came down here to work at the naval station as a legal assistance officer. Not a JAG officer, but but they needed somebody to fill in for an attorney who had been there who was out on she was pregnant and giving birth, so she was on leave for 6 to 8, 9 months. And so I said, I'll fill in that position. I wanted a position with the city attorney's office in Los Angeles as a prosecutor, but at the time they wouldn't hire unless you had actually passed the bar. And I had just taken the bar, and I ended up passing the bar the first time, so in November. So I gave my notice after 6 months, and I went up to LA and took a job there. Yeah.
So so you started your first attorney job was then with the LA City Attorney's Office.
Well, I worked here as an attorney because in the government you can work in that capacity without having been a member of a state bar, as long as you have law.
So were you living in Long Beach and working for the city of Los Angeles, or did you move back to Los Angeles?
No, I was still mostly in LA, and I would come down and I would spend time here, but I ended up going back home.
So tell us about your career with the city of Los Angeles. You were now working for, was it Burt Pines? Was he the city attorney back then?
Yes, he was. We went to, I started off in training, like we did with other attorneys, and learned how to do a criminal case and try cases and stuff like that. While I was preparing for my first trial on my own, my father passed. And it was unexpected, but he passed, and my biological father, and I was very close with him. I mean, we talked almost every day. Anyway, he ended up passing. I ended up taking a few days off, obviously, because of that. Didn't end up trying that first case. I had to wait for another case to come by. I did that and probably tried over the 3 years I was there. I took at least over 100, 150 cases to trial. Some of them didn't really last because we worked things out. And I left the office because I had worked on the Carter campaign, President Carter's campaign.
So now it's 1976?
76.
Carter's running for president. Okay.
Yeah.
And your mother was involved in that campaign as well, right?
She was. Well, she was going to have a lot of campaigns at all. But Glenn was also in Congress by this time.
Okay.
And so, he'd been He lost the election to Reagan and Finch when they came in as governor and lieutenant governor in 66, 8 years. And then he was out for 2 years, and during that 2 years, he was doing stuff that he did before he ever got elected to anything. He ran a business and stuff like that, and he was building homes, and I actually was helping, knocking and doing stuff, whatever. I was picking up leftover stuff and putting it away. Glenn was very frugal. He would make us take nails that had not gone in properly and straighten them out so he could be used again. He was like that. He wanted it. He saved money, and it was important. Anyway, he got elected 2 years later to Congress, and he was there for the 24 years. He asked me if I was interested in coming back to work. I had worked as an intern while I was still in undergrad, but then after law school, I ended up when Carter. And after I worked at the city attorney's office, they asked me if I was interested in possibly a job in D.C., and I said, sure. So I got the book, took a look at all the different things, and I went to the White House, interviewed twice, and they decided to put me with the Secretary of Transportation. Originally as a a person that would work with Congress and with the Senate to work on legislation. And then 2 weeks before I was moving back to Washington, and Cookie's here, right? Oh, there she is. Cookie and I, who were married at the time, I got I got a call because I just helped them with how they would solve a problem with the Congress. I mean, who they should go to and talk to about a certain bill and stuff that they were working on. And I hadn't moved there yet, and they said to me, and this was about 5 o'clock or 6 o'clock at night, my time, so it had to be after 7 or 8 or 9 o'clock their time, said, you know a lot about how this is going on and what's going on there. And I said, but you haven't lived here for a couple of years. And I said, well, yeah, and they said, how do you know all these people? I mean, all the Congress people. I said, well, my parents. And they said, who are your parents? Honest to God, they did not know when they hired me that I was related to Glenn Anderson and Lee Anderson. And all of a sudden he said, I hear this coming back, the chairman is your father? And I said, well, yeah, but it's not just that committee. There's other committees that are involved. Well, yeah, but I don't know if we can do this. And I said, wait a minute, I've already given my notice. I'm leaving next week, in a week and a half to come to Washington, move to Washington. We've already got the movers. Everything's going to happen. And they said, well, we have to talk to the White House. Well, 2 days later, they finally called me back and said, you're coming back and you're going to work for the Secretary of Transportation, but now you're going to be in the General Counsel's office because you're an attorney, and that's where you'll be. And what did I end up doing almost the entire time? I worked on legislation that we went up to the Hill. I just didn't get paid as well as the other one.
Attorneys didn't get paid as well as lobbyists back then?
It wasn't a lobbyist. It was
Government
the
affairs.
government affairs with and it was high enough up that it would have been a difference back then was about $5,000.
So how long were you in Washington, D.C. then, before you came back?
I was there till the next election, and after the election actually, but we came back mostly because Cookie had a good job before I did, and I just came back and then to open up practice. Ended up a judge who I'd been close to, Judge Nebron, who was like a third father to me, I guess you might say. He took a liking. He made sure I was put on a panel so I would get some work done, and I did that.
So you came back and you started a private law practice, and you were living in Long Beach?
No, I was living in Harbor City actually initially.
Was your practice in Harbor City as well, or was that in Long Beach?
No. I opened up temporarily in that area, but I ended up moving into the Ball Hunt Howard Brown and Barowitz law firm.
Here in the office here in Long Beach.
Yeah.
So we're kind of leading up now to 1986 when you started your political career, but you were involved in the community before you
I was
ran
on the
for-
Democratic County Committee. I'd been elected to that. I was I was involved in some other things. I actually ran for judge because when I was a city prosecutor, I worked, I won't say which commissioner, judge it was a commissioner. And I was a prosecutor. I never lost in his courtroom, but I didn't believe I should have won in probably 20% of those cases. I mean, after the evidence was heard, but he still managed to find them guilty. And it bothered me that he was playing favorites or whatever he was doing. And so I ended up running, but he ended up winning.
So now you're. By the way, I think I was just told we have like 2 minutes before the break.
Sorry.
So we're now getting to the part where you run in 1986
Yeah.
for city council. What part of the city was the district in which you were running, and what were the issues in your first run? Your first race for city council.
Okay, so where you're sitting right now is part of the first district, back then. It is now, actually, it's back in the first district again. But back then, I had everything from the ocean to Anaheim, from Los Angeles, the border in Los Angeles, over to, not quite, to Gaviota, just before Cherry. It was a very needy area at the time. We had a lot.
What was the status of the naval shipyard? Because that was...
No, we still had the naval shipyard. We
Okay.
didn't, it was in my second term that we had a problem. We were going to Washington trying to convince them to keep it, not to close it up. Especially the shipyard, not just the naval station as well.
yeah.
I mean, both ended up being closed. The shipyard, there was no real good shipyard. San Diego didn't have a shipyard as good, I think, as good as this one. Anyway, that was that. You asked me, what
Well,
was
the area was in flux, basically. This downtown area, we were losing.
Yes.
The Navy station was still here, but we had very few personnel.
Well, first of all, the redevelopment had done a lot along Ocean Boulevard, but Pine Avenue was basically shut down. The Buffum's was closing. There was very little retail and restaurants, almost nothing available. There was a small little Filipino restaurant, like a counter, just for lunch or something like that. There was a couple other things, but really not very much. And so we had to take it on to try to do something and bring the downtown. So eventually we managed to get a theater, and we got other kinds of things, along the way. Legends opened up a place. It was Mums, and we had there was a number of different restaurants. The Kings, I got the Kings to open up a restaurant, on the corner, and then one thing led to another, and we started to have a pretty good downtown again. It still wasn't perfect.
This is a great transition time for this event because we're going to talk about the transition that happened in downtown Long Beach when Evan was the council member there. So let's take a pause, and when we come back, we're going to talk a lot about the 2 terms on the city council that Evan Anderson Braude served. But we just got to the campaign, your first campaign for city council. In fact, I'm not sure if I remember this correctly, but who did you run against the first time you ran for city council when you got elected? I'm not sure I remember. Let's see if I'm right on this. Hold the microphone up.
Yeah. Can you hear me now?
There you go.
Back there? Okay. I'm sorry I didn't do that the first half. Somebody didn't bother to tell me. Yeah, we'll have to start over, right? Well, there were quite a few people who ran. When I first ran, there were probably 13. Yeah.
Wow.
I couldn't remember if it was 12 or 13. And one of them was had worked for the previous city council person, Joy Melton, and the other one was Mark Roller. But no, and the other person was Jenny Orpezzo. Jenny, anyway, Jenny, it was, in fact, I remember later on, Jenny, we were at UCLA for because I was on the government affairs committee with them, and she came up. We invited her up when she was in the state legislature to talk to her about the university. And one of the things she said, they were going around the room everyone was introducing themselves. And when it came to me, she said, "Oh, I know Evan. He's the only man who beat me." and let me say, the funny thing is, everybody was supporting in the community that I was closest to, was supporting Jenny for the first time because they had wanted to have a Latino on the council, and in fact, Bonnie supported Jenny. And she didn't live
we're getting to the higher dollar questions right now, but go ahead.
Luckily, she didn't live in the district, so she couldn't vote.
Okay.
Anyway.
So there were 12 or 13, maybe 14 candidates.
Yeah.
So obviously you didn't win in the runoff. There was a primary and then a runoff election.
Yeah, and the two people who won in the primary, there was another gentleman. He actually was involved with Republican Party politics. He was also an attorney. So the two attorneys ended up being in the final run, and it was a hard-fought campaign. The problem in the first district, however, because there are so many other issues in the first district, a lot of people were barely back then, making it. They didn't really think about politics. We all had the same size districts. We're all about 50,000 people in our districts. However, it wasn't as involved politically because they had their day-to-day lives were pretty tough. We would have maybe 6,000 votes in total, where in the third district, where there's a lot more involvement, they'd have 20,000, 22,000, 25,000 people voting. So it was quite different. But anyway, it ended up, we had a runoff, and I got Jenny and the others to support me, and we ended up winning in the long run.
Okay. Yeah, we can clap for that. All right, so you had alluded earlier to the smoking ban that you introduced, and we can talk about that. But I also want to talk about, through the history of gay rights, Long Beach, I think, probably at least in recent history, has been very open, but we weren't as open then as we are today. So what was the environment like? And tell us about the actions you had to take. Also in the late 1980s, there was an issue. HIV.
1880s? Well, yeah.
HIV was a very serious problem everywhere, and there was rampant discrimination. And I know that you authored some legislation to protect people from discrimination based on sexual orientation and based on HIV status. You want to talk about any of the legislation you introduced as a council member in that area?
Okay, so the first thing we'll mention the last thing you just mentioned, discrimination, etc. Number one, when I came got more involved in the city, we had a growing involvement with the LGBTQ community, excuse me, and I didn't hesitate. I guess I had grown up sort of in the west side of town, Westchester and West LA, where we were possibly a little more liberal on some of these ideas, a little more progressive. And when I came here, the council was pretty well split in a lot of stuff, but they were a little more conservative, and I understood that, and I had to play that in a certain way. But I was real clear that I thought we had to be supportive of all of our community, and if that included the LGBT community, it included all the other minorities that we had living in our community, and I think it's turned out that the city has ultimately followed that rule. But initially, the city council was not the city council, the manager department and stuff were charging for the Gay Pride Festival and way too much money. They didn't understand that we were getting a lot of people coming here and was going to bring money into the city. And I think at one point we were the second largest program. I mean, outside of the racing through the streets, the Grand Prix, this was the second largest major event coming on in Long Beach.
Did we have the Pride Parade back then?
Yeah,
Did Long Beach-
yes.
Did you ride in the Pride Parade?
I did. I was the first non-gay member of the community not community, but elected community to participate in the parade. And I remember there was a guy named Bible Bob who would come down to the council, and he would also scream at us when we were in the parade. And he came down to me and said, "Braude, you're going to hell." And I said, not that Jews don't believe in some sort of purgatory or whatever, but I don't really, and you have to, I'm not afraid of you. And I said it's the right thing to do, and we need to support this. And we managed to cut down some of the monies that had to be paid, and that was one of the first things I was able to do. The second thing was in writing, and then now everybody, the police, the fire, the mayor, have all participated now, and it's an open event, which it wasn't. And now the city actually sponsors the parade, and has been very helpful. So I'm happy that I was sort of ahead of the curve on that one here. The other thing, when you're talking about, it was during the AIDS crisis, and people didn't understand it, and they were fearful, and so there were all kinds of roadblocks put up in renting. They wanted to rent apartments that they knew you were gay. They weren't. Oh, you could have AIDS, and then you'll give it to everybody in the building. They needed to be educated, but they also needed to have somebody who was willing to push that boundary. And so I got some legislation. It took a little while to get it through the council, but we finally got it through that guarded against businesses. One was dealing with businesses and jobs that they couldn't get fired, just because they were, somebody found out they were gay or whatever, or they would think they might have AIDS or et cetera. And the same thing was in housing. So we did that. Lambda, which was a fairly active club back then, was very helpful in helping me get, people to be supportive, and they ended up giving me some credit for that.
Great. So it was a different city back then, and I remember back in the 80s, people would smoke at restaurants. People smoked on airplanes. But in Long Beach, we were one of the first cities, I think, to take a different stance on this.
The only city that really had a stronger or earlier than we did was San Luis Obispo. Why? I don't know. But the reality is that they had a very strong ordinance.
How did that legislation come about? Why was that a major issue for you?
Well, as I think I mentioned to you in the first part of this tonight, smoking was always difficult for me. To be around it a lot, and I was, and I knew that other people, had the same problem, and the reality was, it wasn't just for the people who coming to places to eat or to drink or to be involved. It was also the people who work there. It was better for the workers if they didn't have to be around all that smoke all the time. They had to work. They had to make money to survive. And so they were being forced to be in an atmosphere that was not good. And so I got involved in the no smoking stuff, and we ended up pushing that through. There were some exceptions and made some exceptions, but there were cases where a lot of the people who ran restaurants were fearful that if they did it, we did it here in Long Beach, that the other cities around us would end up taking all the business and they would lose business. The reality was just the opposite. We ended up doing extremely well. One example I will give, there was a steakhouse down on 2nd Street in Belmont, not Belmont Shore, in the Naples Island. Huh? Kelly's, yeah, Kelly's. And Kelly's was so upset with me that they started a petition to have me removed because they had the bar and the restaurant and everything like that. And I love Kelly's, but I was sort of persona non grata there. And as it turns out, years afterward, and like I said, they started the petition. They didn't go anywhere. It didn't really get very far. But years later, my mother was there with the Wygods, Dr. Wygod, some of you remember, and Myrna Wygod. And I was driving nearby, and my mother happened to call me, and I said, "Where are you?" And she says, "We're at Kelly's." And she said, "Why don't you stop by and say hi?" So I did. I pulled in, and I said, "Well, okay." And I came in, and they were sitting in a booth right across from where the bar was. And I pulled in, sat in the bar. I didn't see the owner. He didn't see me, at least. And then while we were sitting there, here comes the owner down the way, and he comes to our table, and he says hello to the Wygods, and they introduce him to my mother, and then they introduce him to me, and he said, "I know Evan." And then he said, I said, "We know each other." And he said, "I want you to know, I apologize. That was the best thing that ever happened to our restaurant."
Wow. Very cool.
There you go.
So after that, more cities adopted bans, and then eventually there was statewide legislation.
And the
right?
statewide legislation I was involved in too, because Terry Friedman, Terry Friedman, who was the author of the bill in Sacramento, and I consulted with him, and we ended up getting a really good bill. One of the problems that was going to happen with the bill was that there was some move that the state would have control. So whoever had the way it originally was set up, the state would just have the control, and then Long Beach would lose some of its safety things. And as it turns out, Terry and I figured out how to, and they changed it, and they managed to get it through that it was whichever was the stronger one was the one that would win out, and that's how we ended up being able to be even stronger than the state was at that time.
And now it's statewide.
Yeah.
So, well, congratulations with that.
The downtown was, trying to get people to come downtown, and the restaurants and all those things. We had, there's a lot of things about that. I don't have to go. One of the things I wanted to mention was the Crest Lofts. Now, the Crest Lofts was a building before anybody lived there. Remember, it was a Crest department store or a five and dime store or whatever. Anyway, it had gone empty for years, and there was all kinds of vandalism and people living in, starting fires in there and stuff like that. And the city said they were going to tear it down, and it was a historical building. There was really a lovely building, could be made into something. And I basically said to the council when they were voting to tear it down, because the person who had taken money from the city, redevelopment money, had taken the money and ran and was out of the country. And we were stuck with it. And so I found a buyer, or I said the buyer found me, I guess, somehow. We found each other. And he said that they wanted to make it into lofts. And we didn't have a loft ordinance or anything. So we ended up helping to get that through. And now it's one of the premier buildings down there and has really good, and I remember them opening it up, and in fact, I think Danny Lowenthal, Judge Lowenthal is here. He had I think he was the first owner of one of the major, he and Suja Lowenthal at the time, bought one of the penthouses up there. And it's still there and still doing well. And several other buildings have become lost too.
Yeah, let me ask about that, because the adaptive reuse that was happening at that time, I mean, the historical part of the city was your district.
Yes.
You were the council member in downtown, so I assume that you were involved in the historical preservation of some of these sites that have a lot of meaning to us today that were not destroyed. We lost a lot. Many were destroyed before then.
Yes.
But do you want to talk about that, the effort to preserve some of the landmarks?
When I was running for office, we had the Long Beach Heritage, I believe it was, along with maybe another group, sponsored not a debate, but a meet the candidates. And I know Grabinski was there, I was there, a few others, and they asked me how I stood on these things. And I said, I grew up in a city, I'm in a little more modern area of the city, but I always enjoyed historical places. And I would be very happy to participate and sponsor ordinances, legislation locally to try to save whatever we can. And I think we helped get a first historic officer, here to the city. Ruth Ann Lair.
So she was a city employee, a historic preservation officer. That happened when you were on the council.
Yes. And we worked very close together to try that. And of course, most of the area, Bonnie and I live in a 1907 craftsman home in Carroll Park, which is a historical neighborhood. We really have found our niche in that area. It's nice to save these things if we can. In fact, one of the failures I had, failures the city had, was not saving the Pacific Coast Club. It came to the developer, Rob Bellevue, had come down. He had bought the Pacific Coast Club buildings and the property, and he had a really interesting design that would allow for a great deal of the front of the building to be saved, so you'd have the historical look to it, and would build both a hotel as well as a restaurant and stuff like that. And some of it, the way it was being built, and our next door neighbor, who I appreciate, they were very involved, and many of them had supported me for city council, were much opposed to it. And they had said, well, it's going to block our view from down the coast. And I said, but if they build what they eventually did build, that's going to block it even more. And the reality was they couldn't accept that. They were sure that they were going to be able to defeat it, and then this guy would go away. No, he had millions of dollars invested in this place, and he was not going to go away. And he had a plan that was allowed to be built, which was a modern building then, and everything was gone from the Pacific Coast Club. Rob would have been here tonight, but I saw him the other day, and they were leaving town, going out of the country, and he came several years ago to the Historical Society on a Friday night, one of our first Fridays, ended up talking about the challenges that he had, and he ended up losing a lot of money anyway because of that. But it was really sad, and some of the council members all said that, well, they didn't all say. Some of them, they voted it down 5-4, which was a big mistake, and I think they finally realized that, but it was too late.
So you served 2 terms on the city council. Back then, did we have a term limits of 2 terms?
No, there was no. Well, when I first got on the council, there was no term limits. One of the eventual council members who became a council member, had been involved in putting term limits on, and the term limits applied to not to you, thank goodness, or the city attorney or the city controller, but did apply to the other elected officials, the mayor and the councils and so on and so forth. And because it was passed while I was already finished with my first term, I could have gone another term with no problem. But I frankly, even though the city took up a lot of my time, I probably spent 60 hours a week, on city business.
Which is supposed to be a part-time job. City council
technically under the charter, it's a part-time position. And back when I first got on the council, it was $11,700 and whatever dollars. When I got off the council, it jumped way up to $21,000 8 years later, and that's why I had to have other work outside. And when it ended up, I just really couldn't afford to be there anymore. I had a son who's here with me tonight, and his fiance.
Thank you for joining us.
And who just came in from Washington, D.C. this morning at 8:41 this morning. And anyway.
Also, something else happened in your second term on city council. You were the Democratic nominee for Congress.
Yes.
Let's talk about that experience. Okay. So in the middle of your second term, what happened?
Middle of my second term. Well, first of all, what happened, my stepfather, Glenn Anderson, started to show serious signs of Alzheimer's. and dementia. And although he could pretty much do most of the day-to-day as long as the staff was with him. The problem is my mother, when he was going to run again thought he was going to run again for office, wouldn't file his papers. But in the meantime, on top of that, they did a redistricting because it was right after, it was 1990, they had the census and they did a redistricting. And the Democrats wanted to pick up more seats, as they have recently. And they took a lot of Democrats out of this seat, knowing that he was not going to be there, and thought they could make more seats. So we went from a 64% Democratic district.
So safe Democratic seat.
Safe Democratic seat, to a 42-41 Democratic seat, 40%, with 19% undecided, or at least not either Democrat or Republican, and which made it a lot more difficult. But we decided to try it anyway, and we did. I got out of the 6 or 7 people that were running for the seat, I ended up winning the Democratic nomination, and spent. Back then, I thought it was more money than I ever could imagine. I think the total amount of my campaign was maybe 220,000 or something like that. Today, that isn't, you can't even think about running if you're not raising more than millions of dollars. But at the time, it was a lot. And the person I was expecting to run against was a guy was a former legislator who was on the Republican side. And this, by the way, was not when we didn't have the jungle primary that we have now. It was, you ran in your party. If you won your party, you were in the final in November. And the Republicans ran against the Republicans, Democrats ran, and whatever other parties there were, they ran against each other, and they would all show up in November, or the winners of each of those parties. In the Republican Party, there were either 8 or 9 people running. One of them was former president of Cal State Long Beach, Steve Horn, and he was well known in the community. He had been involved, obviously, in the community for a long time. But he was, and it's hard to say this today, he was a moderate Republican who had worked for Senator Keesal, our U.S. Senator one time, had been always in the forefront of civil rights issues, and he actually was pro-choice. He was, he felt that, weapons should be, managed better than they are now. And anyway, the bottom line is the other candidates in the race, all the other 7 candidates in the race, were trying to be more conservative than the guy who everybody thought was going to win. And as it turns out, only one person in the sort of moderate side ended up having enough votes, and he got 40 votes more than he needed, to win. And so we ended, and the funny thing is, he had told me during the campaign he wasn't expecting to win. He really thought it was going to be one of the...
The other candidate was Dennis Brown.
Dennis
he was
Brown.
the conservative one.
He was the one he was known in the legislature as Dr. No, because he voted against everything. And it turns out, Dr. No, anyway, did not win. But when everybody expected him to win during one of those debates, not when I was debating Steve Horn, but he was debating. Steve came up to me afterwards and he said, "I have to tell you, there's no way I can support our ticket if one of these guys wins. I'm going to be endorsing you." I said, "Thank you." And then we ended up running against each other, and he ended up beating me by about 2%, about 1.5%.
A few years later, you ran for legal position in Long Beach, if I'm not mistaken, against my predecessor.
Yeah.
Yeah, tell me about that. That would have been 1998 when Tom Reeves ran for city prosecutor.
Right. The city prosecutor's office, let me say, I'm really, as you know, at one point I was asked to run, and I was thinking of running again, and you were going to run, and we talked to each other on the phone. I was in Hawaii on a vacation, and I found out you were running, and I said, if you're running, I don't have to run. You will do what's needed to be done to make this a good office. And it was pretty
Sorry,
clear.
could you say that in the microphone a little bit louder? Just kidding. You don't have to say that again. Thank you, though. I appreciate that.
I know, it's true. It's true. I remember very clearly. Anyway, the bottom line was I had, in private practice, I had been the attorney for a gentleman who owned a number of businesses. And one of those businesses was Fritz That's It. I don't want to ask, I'm not going to ask how many of you have been there. It's not open anymore. But it was in Bellflower. It wasn't in Long Beach and it wasn't in Los Angeles. But it was in Bellflower. And so I did, and he had, there was some minor, very minor problem that he ran into with ABC, Alcohol Beverage Control. And make a long story short, I wrote a letter on his behalf, along with the sheriff, along with a bunch of other organizations, saying how wonderful he was to the community and whatever. And even though he had women who were less dressed than most of everybody here tonight, the fact is, they wanted to take his license away for, I don't know, a month or something like that. And I wrote on behalf that he had been a really good citizen and so on and so forth, whatever. That's what I wrote. Wasn't anything bad. But one of the candidates in my race, will go, I know who it was. I don't have to say.
I hear murmuring.
But the reality was she made a big deal out of it and I was supporting a sex, whatever, I don't know, whatever it was. And I lost some support because she was also involved in the Democratic Party politics, and she had been an office holder and wanted to run for this office. She had no background in being a prosecutor at all. She had barely been an attorney. I mean, she never went to court. She never did anything. So the reality was that, she did that, and some of those people who had been supportive didn't, and therefore I lost the race. So it is what it is, but it was okay.
I wanted to just add that you were one of the first people that I called when I made a decision in late 2009 that I was going to run for office. You were one of the first people I called, number one, to make sure you wouldn't run against me. But more importantly, because I wanted to get your advice and your help, and I appreciate that very much. And I think this is a great time to segue to audience questions. But you've stayed involved in Long Beach, and those of us who have been around a while, we've seen people come and go. And it's great to have someone who has been here a long time, who knows the history of our city, who's been involved in civil rights in our city, who's been involved in historical preservation in our city, and still to this day is involved. So I do want to open it up to questions. I think it's the time to do that. What I don't know is who's going to hand the microphone to anyone in the audience.
Julie?
And while we're looking for the microphone, Evan, I do want to ask you a question. So Long Beach today is different from the Long Beach where you served on the city council. How would you describe the differences between today and the late 80s, early 90s when you were on the city council?
Well, I think the city, number one, has become more, we have people from different walks of life and different kinds of, back even before when I was on the council, I mean, I used to hear stories about if you didn't get the endorsement of the Press Telegram because you couldn't get elected. Because at one time, remember, everybody was elected as a whole. And then they went to districts. Everybody was white. One exception was, not Clarence. Before Clarence, there was Jim Wilson. And in fact, Jim Wilson was one of the first people I went to see when I was thinking about running to find out what his thoughts were, should I run? And the reality is now, we have people from Cambodians, and it looks more like the city in some ways. Whether or not I always agree with what the current members of the council on various issues, it doesn't really matter. But the reality is that they're there and they're doing their best, and they seem to be. I still feel the council. I've always felt this. there's a lot of work the city needs, and they should be full-time. They shouldn't be part-time. There are cities that are way smaller than us that are full-time or paid a lot better. The council under the rules gets 1/4 of whatever the mayor makes. So now they make a little bit more. They make, I think, more like 40 or 50,000 a year. But the reality is, if they're spending any kind of time like I spent. Now, granted, I got elected to represent the 36 cities on the east side of LA at the RTD and then the MTA board, so transportation. We need to have more representation on regional boards. We are a major city. We are the only city outside of LA. I mean, in this whole 88 cities in this county, and we're the only ones that has a port, a major port. A port besides LA. We have our own airport. We have our own universities. We have, we have all these things going on, and we have our own health department. We have major events that come on in the city. So we have to continually deal with that. One thing I was going to say, even though I obviously stayed and lived here and everything, I did work for the city of Los Angeles again as the assistant city attorney, the special assistant to Jim Hahn, who at one time was I taught how to do a trial, even though I had known him since we were kids, because his father was Kenny Hahn and my dad, Glenn. We would go to various functions together, and we got to know each other, and including his sister, was now our supervisor. But the reality is, when I went up there, I did many things. I worked with the Port of Los Angeles. I worked with the legal department. I worked with the legal departments of Department of Water and Power. I worked with the legal departments of the airport. And so a lot of that experience was helpful in being involved with the city here and with the organizations that I belong to now. I'm still involved with Cambodia's. We actually helped set up the Sister City program with Phnom Penh. We been there several times, and we have people here from Cambodia town and from Phnom Penh Sister City. I saw them earlier, and we have people from the Jewish Federation, or now it's called Jewish Long Beach, that I'm involved in and sit on the board, and now the Rancho Los Alamitos, which I'm very proud to sit on as well. So and Long Beach Affordable Housing Coalition, where we are working with people who need affordable housing, and we have almost 400 or 500 units that we do. Anyway,
this man is still as involved today as he was back then. So, thank you, and I think we're going to go to some questions. Do we have time for questions? Yeah. Please give Evan Anderson Braude a hand.
Lucky me. Evan, you were one of the founders of the House of Justice, and I'd like to learn more about it and the founding and what it does now.
Okay. Well, I just was asked about the House of Justice. It's that's sort of the English name. The actual physical name is called Bet Tzedek. It's two Hebrew words. Bet means house, and Tzedek means justice. And we formed it. I was my third year of law school, and I had a professor, a civil rights professor, who I actually knew from years before involved in some Jewish youth organization. He took over a class that I was in, and he saw me, and he said, "Happy, right?" I said, "Yeah," and he said, and I knew it was Stan Levy, and he said, "We just saw the census. This was the 1970 census, and in the Beverly Fairfax area, not just in that area, but throughout the county, there were over 55,000 people who were Jewish, at least by religion, who were living below poverty, which was unusual. I mean, at least many of us wouldn't have thought that necessarily. Most of them are professionals or have jobs and stuff like that, but they were living in poverty. And the question was, shouldn't we do something? Because they don't go to the normal legal aid, because they're directed to other communities that have problems. And so he said, we're getting together to discuss how we might be able, as young Jewish attorneys and whatever, to be able to talk, see if we can help their issues. Well, as it turns out, we opened up, we started meeting. I came to the either second or third meeting where they had already had a few meetings to discuss some things. And then we started working seriously, and we started adding people to our board. And we opened up the year I graduated and took the bar. And we opened up a small office 1 day a week on Sundays, because that's when we had free time. And we would meet with community members in the area, and we did a lot of work with them. But of course, once the word got out that we did this for free, more and more people wanted to come, and we ended up, as attorneys, we were giving $5 or $10 a month ourselves just to be able to rent this little space on Fairfax Boulevard. As it turned out, we didn't have our first staff person for almost a year, and a secretary who then would take intake, and then we had a friend of mine who one of the others, who became the director. Right now, that little office that only saw maybe one or two staff people now has 165 staff members. Wow. I can't even remember the whole budget. I know that we have a dinner once a year, usually February or March, where we honor people, and we have like 1,800 people who come to the dinner, and we raise about $2.5 million. But that's not the important thing. The important thing is we serve over 20,000 people a year in some form. Now, not just the staff members, but there are a lot of volunteers who, and we bring in attorneys and law firms that will take cases that have to go to court or have to be dealt with. And we work with a lot of people from all walks of life. And they have to meet the requirements of being, not a lot of money, or they have a special issue that needs something we want to deal with. But we're working on everything, including another issues.
Who has the microphone?
Sorry.
Okay, thank you. Please.
Forgive me.
Hi, Evan. I know that this is Tia San.
Oh.
I know you've been involved in the Cambodian community, you and Bonnie. I just wonder, when the first time you really connected to Cambodian community and get involved all that time? So I know both of you since 1991, but I did not know both of you before that. How do you connect it to Cambodian community?
Well, when I was on the council, I did represent a number of constituents were Cambodian. And, we started to get to know that there was a community there that wasn't really needed help. And I think that was part of it. Then Bonnie and I, when we were together, we had the previous council person, his wife, Judith, was involved with, what? Judith Luther, right. Was involved with an organization, but she was leaving that organization. It was a Cambodian organization. And she asked Bonnie if she wanted to be involved and take her position. And she did. She became the planning director, I believe, for UCC, United Cambodian Community. And then she went on to work with some other groups, even while she was thinking of running for office. Well, not thinking, she did.
This was before you were on the council.
No, this was after I was on the
Okay.
council.
Great.
Anyway, and it's
the
been, I
microphone is
have to tell you, working with diverse communities is really lovely, especially if they appreciate what you do and how we work together. And I appreciate them.
Evan, I have a sort of really a psychological and spiritual question. And it's really less about resilience and more about hope. You spent 50 plus years being a warrior for social justice and really crafting government that served the public interest rather than self-interest. One could reasonably argue that we're in times where a lot of the fruits of your labor are viewed by powers that be with disdain. In times like these, how do you personally maintain hope?
you know, I wasn't sure exactly how it would come to me, the question. But the reality is, I'm a hopeful person, and I am a positive person generally. I have been obviously very unhappy with the national government as we have it now, and the things that they have done to hurt people down at the level of local communities and groups that I've been supportive of. I think that the pendulum will swing back. I really am hopeful it will. I hope it does it sooner than later. I hope that, this November we will have, and I know not everybody agrees with me, but the reality is that you have to be involved and continue to fight the fight. That is all there is to it. And you have to be able to support candidates that you feel comfortable with, that you think will make a difference. I'm lucky, we are all lucky that we live. I know some people feel like, well, the state of California has gone too far this way or that way, or the city that we live in and doesn't pay attention to my needs or whatever. But the reality is we live in a great state, and we have a lot of things to be thankful for. Not everything is done correctly. That's right. And we're human beings. They're going to make mistakes. But the reality is we're still heading in the right direction in this state, and I hope that we'll be able to continue in that direction. So in a sense, what you're asking me, am I going to give up? No, I'm not giving up. I'm going to continue working until the day I don't get to work at anything. And
Great question, though. Who has the next question?
Evan, I want to thank you very much. It's Teresa Marino. I'm over here. I want to thank you very much for your involvement in the tobacco ordinance. As you know, we have our own health department, and your being instrumental with the ordinance allowed us to form the Coalition for Smoke-Free Long Beach, which then helped to implement the ordinance. And we were a preeminent city in the whole nation. We got phone calls at the health department from all over the nation.
New York City actually called us when I was on the council and wanted to know how we did it.
Yeah, we had calls at the health department from Canada, New Zealand, and other communities in California. But it was your role that made Long Beach one of the strongest cities with the strongest ordinance, and it's unfortunate that there were a couple of breaks in the wall over the past decades, but we still have our ordinance.
Yeah, we do, and as some of the people in this room know, we had the tobacco industry came at us head on, and they ended up getting enough signatures to stop us from implementing the ordinance for almost a little over a year, until we could vote on it. And the voters came back and voted 80%, I believe, for allowing the ordinance to go forward.
Yes. So
Well, thank you for that question. And I want to thank everyone for coming here. I especially want to thank our guest of honor, Evan Anderson Braude, who answered questions for almost 2 hours and shared with us his experience. So please join me in thanking him for helping us.
Just one more word. I want to thank everybody here. I know some of you came because I pleaded with you to come, but the reality is that you are, by being here, you're supporting an organization that I think is real important to making sure that we have the proper history recorded. And the Historical Society of Long Beach is one that's very close to my heart. I mean, I was president for a couple of years, so I do have special involvement. But I do thank you very much for participating tonight. Thank you.
So we found something that Evan might not have that's Historical Society related, that we have a small thank you gift. And We have a gift for Doug, too. Thank you so much for making this happen. It was a really great conversation.